Hello everyone, so today we're going to talk about female reproductive system. For the first part of chapter 27 we talked about male reproductive system, so we're going to go ahead and discuss female reproductive system today. I have this picture here from 30s. It says you may think she's your gal, but she may be everyone's pal. So this is a way of saying to use a condom, and this is pretty advanced for its time, so I just wanted to show you this picture. And then I have another one. So on this picture, this female is sad because her husband is not happy with her, and they are advertising this douching agent, Lysol, and it says a concentrated germ killer, and it's the same thing that we use to clean our floors. So today there's nobody who would recommend that, but this is what they were using as a douching agent. There's another one here. They're recommending Lysol for female hygiene. All these are recommending Lysol for female hygiene, which is kind of ridiculous. So before we start going in detail, let's label some of the parts of the female reproductive system. So there are ovaries, one on left and one right side. So two ovaries. They have these finger-like projections on top. Those are called fimbriae, and these are going to connect with the uterine tubes, also called fallopian tubes. So uterine tubes, and that's going to connect with the uterus here. In addition to that, there are some structures that are going to stabilize the ovary. Those are ovarian ligament, suspensory ligament, and mesovarium. So these are going to support and stabilize ovaries. Also, there's the vagina. There are these folds inside the vagina. So if you remember talking about stomach, the folds were called rugae. So these are called vaginal rugae. This is a mid-sagittal section of the female reproductive system. Here you can see the pubic bone or pubic symphysis, and there is some adipose tissue there, and then there is the urinary bladder, urethral canal, and above it there is the uterus pear-shaped organ that's going to be attached to the fallopian tubes, and these finger-like projections are fimbriae. And then there is the ovary that's going to be held in place by broad and suspensory ligaments. There's the sigmoid colon, S-shaped colon. It's going to go into the anal canal. There is a structure called clitoris. This is a counterpart to the penis of a guy. And just like penis becomes engorged with blood, clitoris becomes engorged with blood during sexual arousal in females. Unlike the penis where the sperm comes out, there's nothing that coming out of the clitoris. Embryologically, it's derived from the same area that becomes a penis in a guy and becomes a clitoris in female. Attached to the clitoris, there is a fold of skin. Actually, there are two. So this is called labium minus and labium majus. Since this is a mid-sagittal section and we're talking about one side, it's called minus and majus. Now if we were talking about both sides, it would be called labia minora and labia majora. Minora means minor lips and majora means major lips. And in between these two lips there are two openings. Anterior is the urethral canal and urethral orifice right here. The other one is the vaginal opening, or the vaginal orifice, and it's for the reproductive function. So in females, there's a complete separation of urinary and reproductive function. Males, they only have one opening. So on an evolutionary point of view, females are more advanced than males. And then next to the vaginal opening, there is the anal canal. And that's when I said that wiping issues become source of UTIs or urinary tract infections in females, because the feces, they might have E. coli in it, and that if wiping is in the anterior direction, that can take material from anus to the urinary opening, and that can lead to the UTI. Uterus is made up of three layers: perimetrium, which is the outside serosal layer; myometrium, that's the muscle layer in between, that's smooth muscle, and that's what's going to contract during childbirth and also during menstruation. Endometrium is the inner lining. So penis is homologous of clitoris. Labia majora or labia majus is homologous of scrotum. Testes are going to be homologous to ovaries in females. There are three ligaments that are aiding in anchoring of the uterus. So there is the broad ligament. It's going to anchor uterus to the pelvis. So the uterus is going to contract during menstruation cycle and fertilization, and also during childbirth. So it's going to move around. So keep it held in place. Broad ligament is going to anchor uterus into pelvis. Also, there's the ovarian ligament. It's going to hold the ovaries in place, and there's a suspensory ligament that's also attaching to the ovary and then to the fimbriae here. In between there is mesovarium. Mesovarium does not cover the ovaries, but it's going to be attaching to the anterior portion of each ovary to the posterior portion of the broad ligament. So on this picture you can see the ovarian ligament attaching to the ovary, and also there's the round ligament of uterus. So you can see the broad ligament right here, and then there's the suspensory ligament, and the round ligament of uterus is attaching uterus to the pelvis. And then you can see same structures in this picture as well. Okay, so when we take one ovary and do a cross section, this is what you can see. So there's the outside of the ovary, that's called cortex, and then again the middle is called medulla. So outside is cortex, middle is medulla, outside is where gametes are going to be produced. So gametes are the sex cells or the eggs in females. This is the broad ligament and the mesovarium attaching ovary to the broad ligament. Also ovarian hilum is where blood vessels are entering the ovary, and then we have these different structures that we're going to go over in upcoming slides. Oogenesis is production of female gametes, and it's going to begin before birth in females. So all the eggs that female needs during her life are going to be formed before birth, and they're going to lie dormant there until she reaches puberty. Once she reaches puberty, one egg a month is going to be released, and that's what we call ovulation. And that's what's coming up next. It's called the ovarian cycle. So ovarian cycle is going to be controlled by two hormones, FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, which is luteinizing hormone, and those are being released from the pituitary gland. It's going to cause the eggs and the follicles to mature. And at puberty, the FSH hormone is going to be initiating the cycle, and the female is going to start releasing one egg per month, which is ovulation. There's a thick membrane that surrounds female egg, and that's called zona pellucida, and it's a layer of granulosa cells, and these are also going to be producing estrogen. The function of estrogen is to stimulate bone and muscle growth. That's why osteoporosis is more common in females once they reach menopause, because the estrogen production declines. It also gives secondary sex characteristics to females and sex-related behavior such as sex drive, and it's going to maintain function of reproductive organs, and it's going to initiate the repair and the growth of uterine lining as well. Okay, so this is a cutaway view of the ovary, and we have the medulla in the middle, cortex around, and cortex is where you have the follicle cells and the oocyte. Female reproductive cycle is 20 days. There are two cycles. There's pre-ovulation cycle and post-ovulation cycle, and it's being controlled by two hormones, FSH and LH. So the first phase, or the pre-ovulation cycle, is called follicular phase. There is the ovulation on day 14, and luteal phase that's controlled by LH hormone. If average cycle is 28 days, we can say from day 1 through 13, it's going to be follicle stimulating hormone that's going to be released, that's going to stimulate the growth of the follicle. So these primary follicles are going to be stimulated, and this is going to become secondary follicle, and then that's going to become tertiary follicle, and this is happening from day 1 through 13, you can say. And on here you can see the egg popping out, and that's the ovulation. So day 14. Day 14 is the ovulation, and day 15 through 28 is the luteal phase. So the hormone that's going to be released is going to be luteinizing hormone, and this is the post-ovulation cycle. So what we have here is the pre-ovulation, ovulation, and then post-ovulation. On this picture, you can see the egg popping out here, and that be day 14. So what we're going to talk about next, what's going on that's going to lead up to the ovulation. So what type of hormones that are being released, what's changing, and what leads up to the ovulation. And then we're going to talk about what happens after ovulation if you get pregnant, and what happens if you don't get pregnant. So I want to start by defining what a follicle is. Follicle is a secretory gland or a sac. And then inside the follicle, you have the oocyte. So these are the follicles, and inside you have the female egg or the oocyte. And when it matures, it's going to get bigger in size, and there's going to be more fluid inside. So we have the primary follicles here, and that's going to become bigger in size. It's going to be called secondary follicle. And then the tertiary follicle right here. And the tertiary follicle can get so big in size that sometimes it's going to create a bulge on the outside of the ovary because so big in size. And when you get pain or tenderness or soreness around that area during ovulation, that's this follicle that's pushing to the nerves and the pelvic region. So we had primary follicle, then secondary follicle. We are still in the follicular phase, tertiary, and then the ovulation. I'm going to go in more detail on this when I show you a microscopic picture of this. Secondary follicle is going to become tertiary follicle, and that can also be called Graafian follicle. Tertiary follicle, it's accumulating a lot of fluid. It's becoming ready to preparing the egg to ovulate or pop out of the ovary. Once the egg releases, that's ovulation, day 14. The follicular cells around the egg are called corona radiata. So these tiny cells around the egg are called corona radiata. So once that happens, so we had the follicle stimulating hormone. The follicles are growing in size because follicle stimulating hormone is being released. And here when the egg pops out, it's going to switch to luteinizing hormone. So there is going to be a peak in a luteinizing hormone on day 14. It's going to cause the egg to pop out of the ovary. And the egg's going to be released in the uterine tube or the fallopian tube here. Okay, so what I just gave you was the overview. Now I'm going to go more in detail what's happening. So far what we know, there are two phases. There is the follicular phase or pre-ovulation phase, and then there is the post-ovulation phase. So on this picture, what you can see primordial oocytes. So primordial means it's been there since beginning of your time, so before birth. So these primordial oocytes, they are surrounded by these follicle cells, which are secretory glands. They're going to release hormones. And that's day 1 here. So we're going to move from day 1, day 28. So there is a rise in FSH hormone that's going to cause stimulation of some of these follicles. And on this picture, we can see there are 2 follicles that cause stimulation of. And each follicle is going to have a oocyte inside. So we have oocyte inside here of each follicle. So what we have so far, we have primary oocyte and we have primary follicles. So we have primary oocyte and we have primary follicles here. One of these follicles, an oocyte, is going to be selected to move on to the next step, and the other one is going to disintegrate. When it moves on to the next step, it's going to become secondary follicle. So keep in mind, here we have secondary follicle, but the oocyte is still primary oocyte. So let's go over this one more time. Primordial oocyte is there before birth. These are going to be surrounded by these follicle cells, and FSH is going to cause stimulation of some of these follicles. In this case, we have 2. And inside these follicles, we have the primary oocyte. One of these is going to be selected to move on to the next stage. So we have primary follicle and primary oocyte. When it moves on to the next stage, it becomes secondary follicle. Oocyte is still primary oocyte. Then we move on to the next step, and the follicle, it's going to enlarge, and it's gonna have a lot of fluid accumulated inside, and it's gonna become tertiary follicle. Now, if this is day 14, but if it was day 13, this oocyte will still be primary oocyte. So it's gonna become secondary oocyte on day 14, just when the ovulation is going to happen. This tertiary follicle, like I said before, it's so large that it creates a bulge on the surface of the ovary that can sometimes cause tenderness and soreness around. Just like the spermatogenesis, oogenesis also goes through mitosis, then meiosis 1, meiosis 2, and then there's fertilization. So we have been looking at the cortex of the ovary, so I'm going to walk you through all of the steps just one more time. So we started here. We started with a couple of follicles, and one of them moves to the next step. That's going to be primary follicle with primary oocyte inside. As it keeps getting large, it's going to become secondary follicle, then the tertiary follicle. But the inside, the oocyte still remains primary oocyte. So we have primary oocyte, primary follicle, secondary follicle, primary oocyte, tertiary follicle, and primary oocyte. And the hormone that's in action here is the FSH hormone. It's stimulating the growth of these follicles. Now, when the LH, that's on day 14 here, LH increases in amount, it's going to cause 2 things. It's going to cause ovulation, that's one. Second thing it's going to cause primary oocyte to become secondary oocyte. The egg pops out, and that's ovulation, day 14. So we had day 1 through 13, day 14, and then the 15 to 28 here. And then there's this structure called corpus luteum. So when the egg pops out, it's gonna float down the fallopian tube, and it leaves behind these follicular cells. And these follicular cells are called corpus luteum. This is collection of the cells that are going to release a hormone called progesterone. And what progesterone is going to do, it's going to thicken the endometrial lining of the uterus, and that's going to have blood and nutrients in it. So it's going to prepare the body for pregnancy. So pro means to prepare, gestation means pregnancy. So it's going to prepare the body for pregnancy. Now, if the egg is fertilized, those blood vessels that are growing in the endometrial lining, they're going to nourish the baby. Otherwise, those blood vessels that grow, they're going to shed through the vaginal canal, and that's what's called a period. One of the old books said that's the womb crying, that woman didn't get pregnant. Okay, so if pregnancy does not occur, this corpus luteum, it's going to decompose or disintegrate further, and that's going to be called corpus albicans, and that's going to happen about 12 days after ovulation. So corpus luteum is going to remain in the ovary until it's determined if a female is pregnant or not. Okay, so uterine tubes, there are 4 regions. So we have the uterus here, fallopian tube or uterine tube here. It's going to have isthmus. Isthmus is going to attach to the uterus. And then there is this region that's a little bit wider compared to here, that's called ampulla. And then we have the infundulum that's going to attach to these finger-like structures that are called fimbriae, those attached to the ovary. Infundulum is going to contain cilia, and cilia is going to help transporting the oocytes. So here we have the uterus cut open. So we have the hollow inside, that's called the uterine cavity. And then this raised part is fundus of uterus. And we also have fundus of stomach when we looked at stomach. It's going to be connected with the uterine tube or uterine part. And then we have the isthmus, ampulla, wider part, infundulum, that's going to be connected to fimbriae, and these fimbriae are connected to the ovary. So you can see that on this side of the picture. And then on bottom here, we have the cervix, cervical canal here. So this part is cervix, there's the cervical canal, and then there is the external os, or external orifice. So external opening, and on this side we have the internal. So we have internal os, cervical canal in the middle, external os here. And then we have the vaginal canal here with the vaginal rugae inside. And if you look here, there are 3 parts. We have the perimetrium, that's the outer covering, outer serosa, myometrium, which is muscle layer, and that's smooth muscle, and that's what's going to contract during period. It's trying to get rid of all the blood, or during childbirth. And the inner lining is endometrium, and that's what's going to grow when the progesterone hormone is being released by the corpus luteum cells. So that's what's gonna grow, that's what's gonna nourish the baby if there is pregnancy. So successful fertilization happens after 12 to 24 hours after ovulation. So the egg is going to pop out of the ovary. It's going to start traveling in the uterine tubes to the uterus. And it's going to happen in the distal end of the uterine tube. The uterus is a muscular organ. It's going to protect the embryo, and it's going to provide nourishment, support. So the endometrial lining is going to provide with the blood vessels and oxygen, and it's also going to remove the waste for developing embryo and fetus. So we already covered this in the last picture, but I'm going to go over it one more time. So we have the endometrial lining and the myometrium. It's going to have longitudinal, circular, and oblique smooth muscle. So if you guys remember digestive tract, when we talked about it, there was circular and longitudinal muscle, but for stomach there was also oblique, longitudinal, and circular. That's what helps with the movement. And then the perimetrium is the outer serosa layer. So we are going to look at the uterine cycle next. This picture, it's showing you the endometrial lining. So what's happening in the endometrial lining as a female goes through the cycle. It's going to have 3 phases, proliferative phase, secretory phase, and menses. And it's the repeating series of changes in endometrial. So we're just looking at the inner lining, the endometrial lining. So I said the endometrial lining, which is made of those blood vessels, it's going to provide nourishment and oxygen to the baby. And on this picture, you can see that's shedding off, and that's the menses phase. So that means the female did not get pregnant, and it's going to cause vasoconstriction of these blood vessels. And when there's vasoconstriction of these blood vessels, they can't get any oxygen and nutrients, and they're going to shed off. And it's going to leave behind some broken blood vessels, and that's what menstruation cycle is. And once all the blood is lost, it's going to start rebuilding. So it's going to start rebuilding, and it's going to prepare for a new cycle, and that's from day 7 to 14. So menses is 0 to 7 days. I never know anybody with the 0 or 1 day period. So 0 to 7 days is menses. 7 to 14 when it's rebuilding, preparing the body for a new cycle. And then from 14 to 28, it's where the endometrial lining is at its thickest, and it's ready for implantation. So let's look at these phases. So we have proliferative phase. That's it's starting to rebuild. It's starting to thicken. It's going to prepare the body for implantation. Secretory phase, endometrial glands enlarge, and this is when it's the thickest. It's going to elongate, and it's going to be ready for implantation if the egg is present. And menses, it's going to be again the 0 to 7 day phase. It's going to be decrease in progesterone and estrogen levels during this phase. And if you remember, after ovulation, there are some cells left behind that turn into corpus luteum, and that's going to start producing progesterone. So we're going to have a lot of progesterone hormone here. And this is the LH phase. So FSH phase and LH phase. And during this phase, we have constriction or vasoconstriction of the blood vessels. So the oxygen supply, nutrient supply is cut to the blood vessels, and they're going to start shedding off. So on this picture, you can see we have the uterus, and then here we have the internal os, cervical canal, external os, and that's going to feed into the vagina. So cervix is going to project from the uterus into the vaginal canal. The vagina is going to be a passageway. It's going to be a passageway for eliminating the blood during menstrual cycle. It's going to hold spermatozoa, so sperm cells before they enter the uterus. So this is where they're going to enter before they enter the uterus. And it's also going to be a passageway for the fetus during birth. So it's a forming portion of birth canal. Okay, so we also have mammary glands in the reproductive system, because there are hormones that are controlling the milk production. So on this picture, we have the pectoral muscle right here, and then the pectoral fat pad, and then the lobes of mammary glands. That's where the milk's going to be produced. And if you follow this picture, we have lobes of the mammary glands, and those are going to feed into these ducts. And those are called lactiferious ducts. And those lactiferious ducts, if you follow this, is going to feed into this. And this is called the lactiferious sinus. And that's going to go into the nipple and the areolar region. And there are some suspensory ligaments there as well that are holding glands in place. This is under the microscope, so you can look at the size of the lactiferious duct on this. So this is a resting mammary gland, and then we have an active mammary gland, and look at the size of lactiferious duct for this one. It's bigger compared to this here. So fertilization is when a sperm unites with the egg. That's going to form a zygote, and zygote will divide into 2-cell embryo through mitosis, and those cells divide into 4-cell embryo. So those steps, mitosis, meiosis, and then it's gonna become a ball of cells, and that's called marilla here. So we have the zygote when the sperm unites with the egg, and that's gonna divide into 2-cell embryo, then 4-cell embryo, then it's gonna form a ball of cells, that's called the marilla, and then it's going to become a blastocyst. So it becomes a blastocyst, which is going to implant in the uterus. So blastocyst is going to eventually implant in the uterus, and that takes about 1 week after fertilization for the implantation of the blastocyst. So it's 6 days, so it's about 7 days average, 6 to 7 days. And it's going to implant in the endometrial lining, and if you remember, that's where we have the blood vessels and the nutrient supply. So on this picture, you can see the embryo is surrounded by amniotic sac, and then we have the placenta here. So fetal portion of the placenta is formed by corneal sac. So we have the placenta, and then one side we have the corneal villi. These are going to secrete the hormone that's going to enter the bloodstream, and it's going to mimic the action of luteinizing hormone. And if you remember, the luteinizing hormone, when that was produced, it stimulated the cells to continue producing progesterone, It's going to mimic the action of luteinizing hormone, which caused the body to produce progesterone. And progesterone was the hormone that was controlling the growth of the blood vessel. So that caused the blood vessel in the endometrial lining to grow. So the placenta is going to release HCG hormone. And this is going to keep the corpus luteum active. That means there's going to be progesterone and the blood vessels won't shed off. That means they're going to keep growing because that's what's needed for the growing embryo. So active corpus luteum, it's going to maintain thick endometrial lining with the blood vessels. It's also going to produce some more hormones. So relaxin, it's going to increase pelvic flexibility during delivery. And then there's another hormone, oxytocin, that's going to be involved there. And dilation of the cervix during birth. So if you looked at previous pictures, the size of cervix is really small, and that's going to dilate a lot during childbirth. And the relaxin is the hormone that's going to play a role in that. Human placental lactation, so milk production in mammary glands. So in the lobules there, it's going to be caused by some of these hormones. Menopause is when a female stops getting her period, and it typically happens around age of 45 and 55, and this is the average. So it doesn't happen always around this number, but it's the average. And on this picture, you can see premenopausal ovary, so the ovulation is happening, and after it's going to stop releasing the hormone and the egg as well. And that's all we have for the female reproductive system.